Hello students and welcome to chapter number 10. In this chapter we will talk about the process of report writing. In the previous chapter we discussed the process of how do we go about planning this big task of report writing. So we talked about, for example, the different types of data and the different types of information that we need to collect and interpret for our report. In this chapter, however, we will talk about the technical process of how do we write a report, the different components of a report, and the different steps that we need to follow so that our report can be an effective one. And here is our roadmap that we will follow for navigating through this chapter. So we will begin with the step of planning. How do we start planning for our report? And then drafting, putting together our first draft. And then, the actual process of writing the report, the different components, the different parts of the report, and then documenting. So how do we make it official? And then finally, basically, it's refining and revising the report so that we ensure that we have taken all comments into consideration. So the first thing that we need to decide on earlier in the process is what type of format do we need for the report that we are writing and submitting to another person or another party or another department. So in typically formal reports, we would have either primarily text reports, reports that are heavy with texts and not a lot of tables and graphics and infographics and charts and graphs and such. And the other type would be both text and graphics, where the report that we're submitting is filled with a lot of graphics and tables and illustrations and visual aids and so on. Informal reports, however, are typically conveyed and sent in a memo or email format. So even though it's an email, but it's basically an email that is reporting something. It's basically a response to a previous request in which we were asked to deliver some sort of information, some sort of data about a particular topic. But if you are going to submit a formal report to an official, an official party, then you need to make the decision. Is it going to be filled with graphics and charts and such, or is it going to be basically a descriptive one that is only filled with text? One of the most common channels for delivering a report is through a presentation software. So things like PowerPoint slides, for example. It's the method of choice for almost all organizations because such reports will be delivered during meetings. So in a meeting you will have a number of different people attending, and using things like PowerPoint slides would make it a lot easier for you to emphasize certain parts, and it's just basically easier for everyone to be able to see the information. um, Typically speaking, in a slide, in a PowerPoint slide, or if you are using any other software than PowerPoint itself, your slides need to be organized. They need to be put together in a way that is clear to the people who are viewing it. So again, just like in the report format, where we would have either reports that are filled with only text, or reports that are basically a mix of both texts and graphics, the same kind of concept also applies to slides. So on the left hand side, we have um, we have a slide that is only filled with text. Now you need to notice a couple of things. For example, how first of all the background is white. The key here is keeping it simple. A white background make it easier for you to just use a simple black font or any color font, and it will be easily shown to your audience. But if you use a different type of background, then you will be very careful with the colors that you select for your font. So keeping it simple is key. Another thing is how you organize your text in bullets. If you notice on the left hand side, even though we don't have any graphs or visual aids here, the texts, the sentences are organized in bullet points. Again, if you keep it, if your slide is only filled with text, putting it in bullet points makes it easier for me as an audience member to track what you're saying, to follow you, and to easily go through and scan through the slide. Another thing that you could pay attention to is how sometimes you can include explanations. However, we always say that one of the key ways of having an effective slide is not to have a lot of text in your slide. Try to use visual aids. If your presentation does not contain visual aids for any reason, then keep your slide simple and not filled and chunky, basically, with a lot of text. So organize, like basically separate and split the text over 2 slides. Instead of having 10 sentences in one slide, just have 5 on the first one and then the other 5 on the next one. You keep it easier for your audience members to track and follow what you're saying. Sometimes, as you can see on the bottom of the slide, you could have your main points reinforced. Basically, you are like putting it in a text box or underlining it or putting it in italics. The goal here is to emphasize, to reinforce, to highlight the most important point in the slide. On the right hand side, we have a slide that is basically composed of a graphic. So it's put together in squares or boxes. Notice how it's easier for the readers to follow such a slide. Again, remember all the tips and guidelines for any graphic. You need to have headings. You need to have your graphics clearly labeled so that we understand exactly what each part means, and just basically keep it simple. A good way to also ensure that you as a presenter are not jumping between slides, and that your readers are also following you easily, is to have numbers. So it would be a good idea to include slide numbers or page numbers for each and every slide, so that if an audience member has a question, he can tell you uh, easily, just please go back to slide number 9, I have a question there. But if you don't have page numbers, it will be a lot more difficult for your audience to refer to a certain slide. Now, something that you need to pay attention to is what is called a talking heading. A talking heading. So in your reports, you have your generic headings, or basically your official headings. So this is the title of this page or the heading of this slide. But then, so this is what you will put in writing. And then you will have something called a talking heading. So what you are going to say. Remember, when you are delivering a report or when you are delivering a presentation, you don't just stand in front of a bunch of people and simply just read what's on the slide or read what's in the report. We don't need you to read for us. We can read ourselves. You can just, otherwise you would have just sent us the presentation through email and we would have just gone through it. What we need to, we came to this meeting for a reason. We want to hear something extra, something that is not on the slide or something that is not on the pages of the report. So this is why we have something called these talking headings, where you are basically telling us these types of what each type of these headings mean, and what are we going to discuss. What is this heading referring to? This is a report. This is a meeting that has been, that has the purpose of discussing a certain topic, something that we have been maybe working on for some time now. So give us what is and tell us what is this heading about and what is this slide about in your words, not only by writing it down in a slide or in a report page. And now let's talk a little about how do we organize the report. So based on what criteria do we present the information and the data that we have in our report or in our presentation? So the goal here is that our information need to be presented in a logical way, in a way that makes sense for the people. We don't want our information to be scattered and not follow any sort of order. So some of the ways that we can organize our report include time. So when it's important for the readers to know the sequence of events. So when it makes more sense, when it makes it more easier for your readers to know, to read the information and to be shown the information in a chronological order, as they refer to it. So basically in a sequence of events, what happened first, then what happened next, and what happens after that. So this is when you organize the information or your report in using time. You could also organize the report using location. So based on geographical or physical locations of where the events took place. So again, it might not be the most effective way to use location for your special report. So make sure that what you are presenting makes sense for your readers. It might make sense for you because you have been involved since the beginning, but again, put yourself in the place of the readers, of those who were not with you since the beginning of this task. So they are maybe not aware of the entire history. So you need to be aware that whether or not the information I'm presenting you is actually something that makes sense. Is it something logical? Or you could organize your information by importance. So this is basically when you want to draw the attention of your readers to important information. So based on how important each and every event or each and every part, each and every section in your report is. So the most important things first, and then you move on to the next one, and so on. So how urgent maybe each and every section is. And then finally, based on criteria. So this is when you are writing analytical and recommendation reports. So sometimes you are writing a report that is basically an analysis of a certain situation, something like a case study, something like whether or not you will make a recommendation that we need to expand the company's operation in this market, or we need to close down a certain plant, or we need to update the software that we are using for human resources. Whatever it is, it's a recommendation or it's an analysis. So sometimes it makes more sense to organize the report or the presentation using criteria. So what criteria are you using to give this recommendation? So sometimes some of the criteria that you will be using for recommending a software, for example, is price. Another would be how user friendly it is. Another criteria could be availability of technical support, etc. So your report is now organized based on these criteria. So the first part of the report is going to talk about the price. The second part of the report is going to talk about how user friendly it is, how easy for the regular average user to use this software, etc. So you have a lot of ways that you can select to organize the report. It's not really clear cut, because sometimes you could use a mix of more than one or two. So the most important concept here, the thing that you need to pay a lot of attention to, is that how you present your report, the way you organize your report needs to make sense to the readers. So use whatever way, whether it's time, location, importance criteria, or even some other way, or a mix of more than 2 or 3, as long as it makes sense for the people and it's easier for the audience members to follow you and understand exactly what you want to say, then you have a nicely organized report. And now let's discuss a little how do we present our findings, conclusions, and recommendations. So what is a report? A report is basically an investigation. So there was a problem, there was a research topic that you have, gone through and researched extensively, and now the purpose of the report is to present what you found to the interested audience, and provide the result of this report, whether it's a recommendation or a decision. And then you need to be very clear about how you effectively present this type of information to your audience. So the findings of your research are basically the results of what you found. So based on the investigation that you conducted, based on the questionnaires that you developed, based on the efforts that you have put forth in order to find out about something. So how do you present these findings? You have to state the type of information that you collected. You have to state the results of what you found. Based, for example, on the results of the survey that you distributed, you have found out that 45% of the building foundation is deteriorated. So in this case, you have to basically show and tell your audience what were the results, what did you find in your investigation, in your report, in your study. And then the conclusion. So based on these results, based on these findings, so now what is the conclusion? What is the answer? What is the result that you will be that you are arriving to? So a conclusion is basically an answer to the research question that was raised already in the introduction. So we mentioned that a report is basically an investigation. It's a research issue. It's a research problem. So you have collected information, you have analyzed this information, you have interpreted this information, and now based on this information, what's happening? So what's the situation? What is the result? The result here is that, for example, the building will not withstand another hurricane. So you have found out in this research issue, in this research investigation, in this report, that 45% of the building is already gone, is already damaged. So what is the conclusion? What is the result? What is the outcome? It's that this building will not be able to withstand any other future damages. So now we move on to the recommendation. So based on this result, based on this conclusion, what is the recommendation? What is the decision that needs to be made? What are you suggesting to the people who have the power, who have the authority to make this decision? You are drawing their attention to a solution to the problem based on the finding and the conclusion. So after you have found out about the reality of the situation, and after you have analyzed it and came up with an answer to reflect what's going on, so now you are providing a solution or a recommendation or a suggestion to the people who have the power to make that decision. So now, what is your suggestion in this case? The foundation needs to be replaced. So the building's foundation must be renewed and refurbished. Otherwise, this building is going to basically collapse. So findings, conclusion, and recommendation. Findings are, the information you collected. The conclusion are the answers to the research question. And then the recommendations are the suggestions, are the solutions that you are suggesting for the people who have the authority and the power to make decisions. Just like you have studied in your English composition courses, you know that for any writing piece, when you are planning it and when you are thinking about what to include, a good tool to use is the outline. So just like you are outlining an essay, you would also outline your report. And what is an outline? It's basically the general headings and the titles that you want to include in your report. So in here we have a partial snapshot of a report. So here we have the title of this report, Working Mothers in Management. So a good outline would definitely show the title of the report, and then you start with your introduction. So in an introduction for a report, you would have to show the purpose and the scope of this report. So why is this report written? Remember, this is a business report, so the purpose here needs to be clearly stated so that the audience members understand exactly what is the point, what is the reason, what is the problem that is being investigated, and therefore they would know how should they approach the process of making the decision about it. And then also the scope. So the scope is, what does it cover? So to which extent does this report go? Is it about the entire problem from, does it cover only, working for our title? Is it only about working mothers in this company, or is it in general, or what type of issues does it touch on, etc.? So to the extent to which this report goes and extends. And then also in the introduction, you need to talk a little about the procedures. So what procedures did you follow in order to write this report? So how did you, investigate the problem? How did you collect information? What did you do? What type of steps did you follow? So these are all important facts that you need to mention to your readers, to the people who are going to read this report, in order for them to be able to have a clear understanding of what's going on, and as a result make an effective decision about the issue. Of course, the second part of the report, right after the introduction, is now our findings. So we mentioned that the findings are what? Are basically the information that we found, or the information that we collected. So for our report, Working Mothers in Management, so we have 3 findings basically. It could be more depending on how long the report is and what type of criteria did you use, what type of questions did you ask, etc. So in here we have the number of working mothers. So that's a good way to start, by giving your readers, by giving your audience some background information so that they would be able to understand the different dimensions of the topic. In B, we have the effects on labor productivity. So remember, our title was Working Mothers in Management. So if we have a lady who has children, and how does that affect her productivity at work? So we would discuss also effects on labor productivity. And then we have special needs of working mothers. So in order for working mothers, for ladies who have children, in order for them to be able to come to work every day without being absent, what do we need to provide them? What are their special needs? What are the different requirements that they have and we should provide as a place of employment, so that they would be able to be more productive? So we go back to the basics. So what are our findings? So based on the questions we asked, these are the findings that we need to provide, that we need to discuss. So where do these findings come from? They come from the research that we conducted. We have probably either just collected information online, maybe we have created a survey or a questionnaire that we distributed, and these are the results of this survey or questionnaire, etc. We go back to chapter 9 and we use all those data collection tools. And then the third part of the report, the next part, is about summary, conclusions, and recommendations, the parts that we discussed in a previous slide. So what is, always before you conclude, you have to provide a summary. So this is a summary of what was discussed, and this is where you highlight the most important information in the report. And then you have to, also offer a conclusion, a way to wrap up the entire writing piece, just like in an essay, just like you learned in English composition. So in a report, what's a conclusion? A conclusion is basically the answers to those research questions, the answers to the problems that you investigated. And then finally, the recommendations are your suggestions, your solutions. So these are, what you are suggesting, what you are recommending, what you think and what you believe are the ways and the keys to help working mothers in this case become more productive. Your recommendation in this case maybe we need to open a daycare center in our company, or maybe we need to give them a more flexible working schedule. So this is a recommendation. And now after you have provided and presented all of this information, this entire report, to a group of people who are your audience, now based on that they are going to make that decision. They are going to say yes, we should do that, or no, we shouldn't do that, or maybe they come up with a different answer altogether. So this is how you outline your report. You have an introduction, you present the findings, and then you present your conclusions and recommendations. How do we choose the headings of our report? So in a report, you have the generic headings. These are the headings that you will put in writing in the slide or in the pages of the report. And then we have the talking headings. Remember, this is a report that will be presented to a group of audience members. So it could be presented in a meeting, or it could be presented in a form of PowerPoint presentation, etc. So we don't want you as a report presenter to simply read what we have on the slide or what we have on the pages of the report. We want you to say something extra. So on the left hand side we have the generic headings. So these are the headings and the titles of the sections of the report that you will put down in writing. So this is what we will read on the PowerPoint slide or on the pages of the report. Current staffing comparisons, for example, performance evaluation summary. So these are the headings that we will have in writing. But when you are talking about this particular section, you don't just read current staffing comparisons. You don't just say that. You expand on it. Okay, so this is the talking heading. So how you are going to now basically jump from one section to another, from one part to another. You don't just read the headings, you bring something extra, you bring it to life. So you now say things like Bishop's staffing level is high compared to that of its competitors. Remember, we came to this meeting, we came to this presentation because we have already a problem in mind, and we have already a research topic, and you are telling us now about what you did regarding this research. So this is your talking point. You do not simply read what's just there. Otherwise, there's no need for you to present it. We can read ourselves. You can stay home, stay at your office, sit at your desk, and just send us your presentation or your report through email, and we will just go through it, individually. There's no need for a meeting, but this is why you do a presentation. You want to bring something extra other than the mere words that are written in the PowerPoint slides or in the report. Look at how we present, for example, the second example. So performance evaluation summary. And now this is basically how you present it to your audience. Employees' performance varies by years of experience. And then you move on to talking about the components of your slide or of your report page. So always keep in mind that you need to bring something extra to the table. You don't simply read what's just there. So far we have been discussing the planning step of the report, including in chapter number 9. There was an entire chapter that's all about planning. This is how, significant the planning step is. You do a lot in terms of planning. You don't just simply start writing something. You have to prepare for it. You have to collect information for it. You have to get some other opinions for it before you even start the process of writing. And now we will move on to the next step in the report writing process, and that is the drafting stage. Now this is when we start thinking about what types of what actual paragraphs are we going to include in our report. So the report, as we mentioned in our outline, we mentioned that we need to have an introduction, we need to present the findings or the body of the report, and then we have the summary, conclusions, and recommendations. So as in any writing piece, an introduction is basically what you are going to tell the audience about. Remember, in English composition, for example, you have 3 simple steps that you need to follow for any writing piece. Tell your audience what you are going to tell them. So that's the introduction. And then the body is tell them. So this is, the actual, body, the actual content of your paragraph or of your essay or of your piece. And then tell them what you told them. So that's your conclusion. The same concept applies for a report. So the introduction of the report is this is the part where you tell your audience, where you tell your readers what information they need to know so that they would be brought up to speed, so they would be, knowledgeable enough about the research problem. Okay, so that when you tell them about the issue, when you tell them about your research findings, everything for them would make sense. So you need to tell them some background information, some historical information if needed, etc. And then in the findings, this is when you analyze and interpret the findings for the readers. So you don't, again, remember, so in the findings, we basically report the results of our survey or the results of our investigation. It could be a survey, it could be basically an online search, it could be some other method of data collection that we used. So in the findings, in this section, in this report, in this part of the report, this is where we make explain the findings to our readers. This is when we tell them. So the results of the survey for this particular question found out that 20% of JUC students spend 3 hours every day to study for their courses. So now analyze it, interpret it, discuss it, describe it, try to send a message using this piece of dry information. Okay, so what does that mean? What does that mean? And then we move on to the summary, conclusions, and recommendations. So this is where you, again, wrap up the entire report. This is where you make those answers. This is where you, make some and deliver some solutions to the issues that you discussed. So in the findings, we just mentioned that 20% of JUC students spend 3 hours or more studying for courses. So what's the conclusion here? This means that JUC students spend a lot more time than their peers in JTI and in JIC studying. So that's the conclusion. So the recommendation here is that maybe we need to reduce the study load for our students in JUC. So this is how you make a report make sense. This is how you present a report in a way that actually makes sense logically to your readers. Otherwise, you could have done a great job collecting information, but it's just the presentation of the report that basically undermined all of your efforts. So when you are drafting, you need to have an introduction. This is where you bring in all the information, the background information that you need for the readers so that they can make sense of what's happening. You need to present the findings. This is when you analyze and interpret the information, the results of your survey, the results of your investigation. And then finally, summary, conclusion, and recommendations. We have talked more than once about them. So this is the significance of those findings and the solutions to those research problems. And now in a report, typically we will have a lot of sections. We will have a lot of different parts of the report. So like what you will do in your co-op report when you are about to graduate. The last thing that you will do for this college before you graduate is that you will do your co-op or a research project, and then you will have to deliver a lengthy report about your co-op experience or about your research project. So just like those reports that you will be submitting as a student, any type of report typically has these types of sections. It begins with a title page. What do you include in a title page? It's the title of the report, things like the company logo, in our case JUC logo, your name, the writer's name, and then the date of the report. So in your co-op you would say this is the field training report written by Mr. X, and this is for Jubail University College, etc., submitted on the particular date that you are using. And then typically also in a report, especially in more formal ones, especially for the reports that will be not only used internally meaning within the same company or organization, but also sent externally to other organizations, you would include a cover letter, memo, or email. So even if you are going to send this report to your teacher, to your co-op supervisor, or if you are an employee and you are going to send this report to your manager, so you don't just come to your manager and just drop the report on their desk. You need to write something. It could be a memo, it could be a letter, it could be an email, that this is the report that you requested of me. I hope it's up to your satisfaction, whatever. So as long as there's some note to introduce the report, then you are fine. And then it begins with a summary, something called an executive summary. So that's basically an abstract or a synopsis of your report. So what does it include? It's basically the gist of your report. This is the essence of the report. So you basically summarize your entire report in 4 sentences, in only a simple short paragraph. So that's the executive summary. Why do we have an executive summary? From the name itself, it's executive. So this is for the purpose of for the benefit of the executives in the company. Executives are those with big positions. The managers, the general managers, the vice presidents. These are called executives. So these people do not have a lot of time to go through all of your 20-page report in detail one by one. What they want sometimes is basically to be able to know what those entire 20 pages about. So they would go directly to the executive summary. So this is a section that you need to pay special attention to, because sometimes your manager is not going to read all 20, 25, 50 pages of yours. He or she is simply going to go directly to that part, directly to that section, executive summary, and read this short paragraph that summarizes and synthesizes the entire report. And then of course you would have a table of content so that it's easier for you readers to locate a particular section, a particular piece of information. So in a table of content you would have headings, subheadings, and page numbers. So organized based on the criteria that we discussed earlier. So you would have your headings of your sections and also subheadings. It's basically like your outline, and then also the page number that of each and every page containing that particular section or heading. And in a typical report, there could be also an appendix. So what's an appendix? It's a section that is not part of the original report, but this is a it supplements the original report. It's supplementary reference material, not relevant enough for the body. So what would you include in an appendix, for example? I know that, for example, in your co-op report, in the appendix, you are going to include any forms that you used during your co-op experience. You would also include in the appendix all your weekly reports. You would also include in the appendix, as a co-op student, any certificates, for example, that you acquired and obtained during your co-op experience. So the appendix is a supplementary section. It helps, it supports your body of the report, but it's not essential enough to be included in the heart of the report. And then finally, any type of report definitely must include a reference page. So this is the list of the secondary sources that you used. Remember, in the types of data we had secondary and primary data. So the sources of the secondary data that you collected, that you used for your report, must be properly cited. And from English composition we have MLA, APA, different citing styles. You need to be careful when it comes to how you cite these references, and you need to include a reference page. Otherwise, this is going to be considered plagiarism, and this is a violation of intellectual property. So be careful and cite sources properly. And now that we have finished drafting and planning our report, this is where we put more thought into the actual phrases and the words and the style of writing that we will use in the report that we are delivering. So in this step, this is where we put more consideration on what type of style, what type of tone, what type of verbs do we even use when we are actually forming our paragraphs. More than once in previous chapters we have talked about the importance of writing style, and we explained style before. We said this is it reflects your unique personality. But remember, this is a business report, so it needs to follow certain guidelines. It needs to be in line with the norms of your organization, with the general norms of business reports in general. So there are certain things that you need to ensure that you are not overstepping on. So things like tone. So what type of how you are basically conveying a certain message. We always say that you have to keep professional and be respectful, and show show that you not only understand what you are talking about, but you are delivering it in a proper manner. So instead of using negative tones and tones that sound a little condescending maybe, or that sounds like you are giving orders instead of suggestions, for example, instead of saying you must change this building or everything will collapse. This is not an appropriate tone to be used in a business writing, in a business report. So you need to dial it down a little. What type of pronouns do you use in your writing for a business report? Remember, this is not a creative writing essay. This is a business report. We just need hard facts and evidence, conclusions, suggestions, recommendations, etc. So even though you are the writer of the report, you don't always say in the report I. You don't say I recommend, I want, I found. This is a business report, so you typically you would use the passive voice, because you are not writing this report in your personal capacity. You are writing this report as a representative of a certain department, a certain organization, a certain company. So you are a representative of this organization. You are a representative of your department. So And also, you don't always say we. Okay, so you would use the passive voice or avoid pronouns altogether if possible. So formulate your sentences in a way where you don't need to use pronouns. And then you also need to pay attention to the tenses of the verbs that you are using in your sentences. So do you use future tense? Do you use passive tense? So typically speaking, you would go back and forth um, between past tenses and and current tenses. So what that means is that you would use things like it was found. So that's the simple past tense. You would also say things like the manager states or the company provides. So that's the present, simple present type of tense. So you don't use more complicated tenses like have been delivered, and only when it's appropriate. But typically speaking, the verb tenses that you would use, you would go back and forth between simple present and simple past. And then emphasis and subordination. So remember, we are talking about style. So if you want to be very effective when it comes to stressing certain information, stressing and emphasizing certain parts, you would use the types of words that would indicate that. And also subordination. So how would you place less emphasis, let's say, when you want to drive the attention away from certain parts. You don't want the reader to be focused on a certain issue. So you would use things like emphasis and subordination by selecting your words in a way that either draws the attention to a certain part or basically takes the attention away from it. And finally, coherence. So coherence is how strongly related each and every section of your report is to one another. So it needs to be shown as a unit. This is an entire report, a writing piece. So when you take one paragraph away from those paragraphs that you have in your report, now the report should not make any sense if you remove one paragraph, because your writing style is coherent. But if you remove a paragraph and the report still makes sense, then maybe you don't need that paragraph altogether. Or maybe you need to paraphrase it, to deliver it in a different way. So coherence is about how each paragraph, each sentence is related to what's before it and what's after it, so that altogether it seems like a strongly related, coherent unit. So we are talking about style still. So here are two examples of what can we do to make these sentences better in terms of tone. So remember, tone is all about how negative and how bossy basically you sound. So if you look at the first example, our turnover rate has skyrocketed in the past year. So what can we change? In the previous slide, we talked about verb tenses, we talked about pronouns, right? We talked about the tone, like you don't need to use highly indicative explicit words. So instead of saying our turnover or my turnover or things, pronouns like that, you could use the passive voice. You could use the passive voice. So you can reword this sentence to be something like the following. The turnover rate in the company showed a sharp increase in the past year. Look at how more professional this now sounds. The turnover rate in the company showed a sharp increase in the past year. So now we dialed down the tone a little, and we're not using pronouns. And we replaced the word skyrocketed because it's kind of a style and a tone issue. You don't say things like skyrocketed because it might be indicative of something that you don't want. And then the second example, the manager claimed that his employees left for better compensation. Now, we totally understand what this means, but now we want to say this sentence in a way, in a way that has better tone, better style, etc. So instead of saying again the manager, you could use the passive voice, or you could keep the same structure as long as there are no pronouns. So the manager stated, you could say stated instead of claimed, or the manager believed that. You don't necessarily say his employees, so this pronoun his might seem a little might not seem too positive. So you want to say that his team members or the employees under his supervision, things like that. Instead of saying his employees, they sound like they are his minions or something. So the manager believed that his team members left, or you can use another way to say left. Like you can say resigned because they received better job offers. As simple as that. Instead of saying better compensation, this indicates that the compensation in our company is not good. So while we want to deliver and pass on this information, we want to also say it in a way that doesn't offend our managers. So another way of changing the tone, of improving the style on this sentence: the manager believed that his team members resigned because they received better job offers. As simple as that. So the pronouns, we mentioned in the previous slides that we need to use appropriate pronouns. We don't use first and second person pronouns a lot, so we use them sparingly. So what does that mean? Let's look at a couple of examples. You don't say I. You don't say I recommend, I have investigated, I have shown. This is kind of an informal way of presenting things. This is a business report. You are not delivering this report in your personal capacity as Mr. X. You are delivering this report in your official capacity as a member of this department or as a member of this team or of this organization. So you don't say things like I recommend that the project be canceled. Instead of saying it like that, you could say, go to the more formal way of saying the project should be canceled. You use the passive voice. If you say things like the writer recommends that the project be canceled, this is an awkward form, an awkward type of way of saying things, because who is the writer in this case? You are. You don't refer to yourself in the third person because this is awkward. You don't say in a meeting, the writer of, the presenter of this PowerPoint slide believes that. Who is the presenter? You are the presenter. So this is going to put you in a very embarrassing situation. Another example here where we use the first person pronoun is when you say I interviewed Jan or Jan Smith. It's correct grammarly, but in terms of the norms followed in business reports, this is an informal way of saying this information. So you could change it to, using the passive voice, Jan Smith was interviewed. So that's a kind of a more effective way, a more formal way that follows the regular norms of business reports. Or you could say, in a personal interview, Jan Smith stated. So you change the structure of the sentence altogether. Remember when I mentioned in a previous slide, sometimes you could avoid pronouns altogether. You don't need to say his, her, or even use the passive voice. You just reword your sentence in a way that basically describes the situation without having to use any pronouns. So in a personal interview, Jan Smith stated, that 1, 2, 3, 4. So try your best to avoid using first and second person pronouns. And now with emphasis and subordination. So how can we improve the style using things like emphasis and subordination? So we devote an appropriate amount of space to a topic. So how long do you need to explain a certain topic? It depends on how significant it is. It depends on how important it is and how complex it is. So you don't talk about a very important issue in just one paragraph. Sometimes you need to talk about a certain issue for 2-3 pages, depending on how long and how complex and how important and how significant it is. You position your major ideas first for the direct plan. Remember, in previous chapters we talked about direct and indirect plans. So in the direct plan, this is when you present your idea first, and then you provide supporting points. In the indirect plan, this is when you provide your supporting points first, and then you present your idea. In this case, you need to organize your ideas in terms of the most important ones first. So your major ideas first. Okay, so the most significant points should be discussed at the very beginning, because this is where our attention is at its highest. And then finally, you use language that directly tells what is more and less important. Remember, emphasis and subordination. So when you want to direct the attention and draw the attention of your readers to a certain point, that's emphasis. When you want to drive it away, this is subordination. So how can we do that? It's by word selection, the phrases and the terms that we use. So you can, as bluntly as this and as directly as this, say that this is an important point, or it is highly significant. You use such terminology so that your readers really are engaged with you and understand exactly that this is a point that they need to pay special attention to. Sometimes it is helpful to add a section overview. What do we mean by a section overview? So it's basically when you are when a section is a little too long, or when a section contains a lot more subheadings. Like in this case, we have regional sales analysis, so that's our major section, and then under regional sales analysis we have a number of different subsections or subheadings or subtitles. We have individual sales, group sales, corporate sales. So it's kind of a lengthy section. So in order to make it easier for our readers to really understand what we want to say in this section, it could be a good idea to include a section overview. So that's text after a main heading overviews content within a section. So that's the two sentences here right below the major heading, regional sales analysis. So these sentences, the Northeast region leads in individual room sales, etc. So that's the section overview here. Remember, this is a big section with a lot of subheadings. So sometimes it would be a good idea to include 1 or 2 sentences, as short or as long as you need them to be, in order to simply just describe and tells us a little about this this next part. It's basically an introduction to the part that we are about to read. Now moving on to the fourth step in our report writing process, and that is documenting. So let's see what we have in documenting the report. Now, why we document sources? So remember the last part that we typically have in a report is the references page, right? So that's documentation. This is when you tell your readers that you got the information in your report from these sources. So why do you do that? Now, because if you don't, now you are plagiarizing yourself. So that's a violation of intellectual property, and someone can actually take you to court over that. So to avoid accusations of plagiarism, that's the first reason. And then also to give credit to the originator of information. Remember, this is their intellectual property. These are the efforts of a different researcher, of a different writer, of a different scholar, of a different scientist. So you need to tell your readers, that these are not my ideas. These, certain parts of the report are not my ideas. These came from this person. So you need to give them credit. They duly deserve credit, if I may add. to demonstrate the validity of our work with credible sources. Remember when we talked about in the previous chapter that not every source on the internet is considered a credible source, is considered a strong source. So when you show your references and you show that you have only taken information from strong sources, credible sources, from universities, from academic journals, from governmental agencies, etc., you show to your readers that not only you have done your homework, but the information presented and the recommendations that you are suggesting at the end of the report are based on really good information that you have gotten from good sources, credible and strong sources. And finally, to instruct readers where to find additional information. Sometimes your managers want to know more about the statistics that you included. So if instead of having to ask you, I will just go to the list to the link that you included in your reference page, and I'll read for myself. So it would be a good idea to always have a reference page. Otherwise, you would be plagiarizing yourself, and you are not going to show how strong the report is based on the sources that you selected. So as always, we have some examples that we could, go through so that we better understand how can we, apply the concepts. In this case, we have a text. So this is a version of a reference from a company president, and he was delivering a statement. So now what is required here is how can you paraphrase these words in two versions, one that retains the quote and another that omits it. So you go back to your English composition courses and try to remember how can you paraphrase and cite. Okay, so what I would advise you to do, if you need some refreshing on how to implement this, there's a nice website by the University of Purdue. It's called the Online Writing Lab, OWL, the Purdue Online Writing Lab. It's a very nicely developed web page that introduces students to how they can use references and citations and paraphrasing, etc. So go there, try to find out some extra information, and come back to this exercise and see how can you paraphrase this statement in two different ways. One with the quote, so one with the actual words of the person, and one without this quote, okay, without those quotation signs. And now we are still on the topic of documentation. So further information about what we can do to better document the sources for our reports, we could have a number of different ways. One of them is to add footnotes or endnotes to the report that we are writing. So if you look at the example on the left-hand side, at the end of the sentence, so right after the dot, right after the full stop, there's a small number 4, right? You see it? So in this number 4 refers to something on the margins of the page, on the below margins of the page. So this indicates the source at the end of the page. So that's one way of documenting your sources, of mentioning your reference by using what is called footnotes or endnotes. And what I would advise you to do here, know how this is done in Microsoft Word. So it's not as simple as it's not just making the font smaller of this number 4. No, there's a particular way of how you can add footnotes or endnotes in Microsoft Word. So this would be more appropriate for text reports. So if you have a report that is filled with a lot of paragraphs, then it would be a good idea to use these footnotes or endnotes. Even though the actually more common way of adding your references is the one on the right hand side where you have a reference page. Even though the slide here says that this is to be used only or more appropriately used for reports and presentation software, but even in written reports, you would have a reference page, as you will do in your co-op or research project report. You would be required. Part of the requirements is to have a reference page. And then in the reference page, there's a particular way of how you write your sources. You don't just mention the name of the website. You don't just mention the name of the book or the name of the magazine or newspaper. There's a particular style. There's a particular order of how you present this. Again, go to the web page that I suggested, the Online Writing Lab, OWL, in the University of Purdue. They would tell you how to cite and how to write these references in these different styles. We have MLA style, we have APA style, we have Chicago style. So depending on what style you are using, and actually the most common way in the academic world is the APA style. So find out about APA and how can you cite and use citations and references appropriately. And with the final step in our process of writing reports, and that is refining. Just like in any writing piece, you have to, review and revise and refine. The same thing applies for your report. Just because you are done writing it, it doesn't mean that you should just go ahead and submit it. You have to read it a couple of times, give it to someone else for advice, and only then you can consider your work completed. So what do we revise for? Remember, we talked about revision before. So we revise for content, we revise for style, and we revise also for correctness. In terms of content, we have to ask ourselves a lot of questions. So to ensure that the content, the information, so the actual facts and proofs and all of those things that we are including in our report, are they up to the expectations of the audience or not? We have to ask, have we included sufficient information to support each point? So in your report, in your writing piece, you are discussing an idea, you are presenting a fact. Have you included sufficient enough information so that it makes sense for the reader? Have you excluded extraneous information? So meaning, you have to ask yourself, from both angles, are there any important information that you forgot to include? Or are you including a lot more additional extra information that are not necessarily needed? So you're just, bothering your audience members with additional information that are not necessarily essential. And then, is all the information accurate? So are you sure that the information you are including in the report, are they up to date? Are they correct? Are they accurate? Okay? And then, is the information presented in an efficient and logical sequence? We go back to the organization of the report. Remember, we said that we can organize the report in terms of time, geography, in terms of location, in terms of importance, etc. So now that I'm finished with my report, I need to read it to see if the flow of information is logical and it makes sense. And then when it comes to style, remember, we have to, what do we review? What do we revise? What do we look for in a style? We look for the verb tenses. We look for negativity and positivity. We look for the tone. Remember? So are the words clear, simple, and concise? In previous chapters, we talked about how sometimes you are using redundancy, where you are basically saying the same thing twice. So you have to ensure that you are omitting any unnecessary words. And are they simple and clear? Are you using a variety of sentence types? Remember, we had simple sentences, complex sentences, etc. Independent clauses, dependent clauses. So are you using a variety of sentence types? You have to use a variety of sentence types. Otherwise, your report is going to sound a little boring, and you are going to come off as someone who, who is not very knowledgeable in writing. Do your paragraphs have unity and coherence? Remember, in style, this is a big part, coherence. So are the different sections related to one another? Are the different sections connected to one another? So the previous sentence is connected to the one before it and the one after it, and then this whole section, this whole page is connected to the next one, so that they all form sort of like a chain, so that if one is broken, if one falls out, then the entire report falls out. So you need to have paragraphs and sentences that are really essential for delivering your ideas. Have you maintained a confident, sincere, and objective tone? We have talked about this in previous chapters. You always have to come off and appear as a confident person. You don't say things like, if you might please, you don't say these things in writing. Okay, so these are my findings, these are my suggestions, these are my conclusions. And are you using a sincere and objective tone? So even though you need to be confident, you don't want to sound condescending, or you don't sound very bossy, like you are giving commands. No, you are giving suggestions, not commands, not orders. So keep a positive, respectful tone, and also objective tone. Objective, so you're not biased. You don't show that you are biased and you have a preference to a certain choice. The decision is totally up to the people who are going to be who have the authority to make that decision. And have you used appropriate emphasis and subordination? Are you drawing the attention of the readers to certain parts, using things like this is clearly significant, this is highly important, etc., or subordination, where you are trying to take the attention away from a certain unnecessary point. And then finally, you revise for correctness. So in terms of correctness, this includes all aspects. So it's not only correctness of information, but things like formatting, typographical errors, grammar, spelling, word usage, punctuation, all of those things. You ensure that your report is flawless. And then, does a colleague catch any errors you may have overlooked? So this is when you give this report to another person with a set fresh of eyes, so that they can take a look at it and tell you if there's something that they don't like, and see if this is something that you need to improve. And finally, formatting and proofreading. This is done in the final stage of refining. So this is very important, because as we mentioned, sometimes your report can be excellent in terms of its content, in terms of the words that you are using, but you need to be to present it in a way that is properly formatted, so that it's even aesthetically pleasing to the readers. So we don't only just revise for content and information and things like that. Even the colors that you are using, page borders, all of those things are are very important in a report. In formatting, you have to use a consistent and logical format. Remember, in things like using parallel sentence structures, so it makes the report seems like it was written by one person. Even if it's written by more than one person, you need to appear as as one author, and you need to keep the needs of the reader in mind. Remember, you are not writing this report for yourself. This is to be read by another group, which they will use to make a decision. So keep their special needs in mind, and it's up to them to judge the report. So you need to include all aspects that you might think they are going to be using to judge you. And then finally, proofreading. So yeah, exactly. Do not destroy your credibility by failing to proofread carefully. You don't do all of this. You don't, write a long report and do an investigation and develop questionnaires and surveys, and you revise and refine and format, and then finally you don't proofread. You don't come to at the end of it and then simply decide to lose interest. You have to be very careful and be meticulous when it comes to proofreading, ensuring that you have revised everything, that you have looked into every single part of the report. This is especially the case when it's a business report, because This could make or break your reputation. This would go on your employment record. If you made a big mistake in this report, you are not going to be trusted easily again by your managers. So when you are proofreading, you are verifying information, ensuring that the content is okay, up to date. You are not plagiarizing yourself, that there are no errors. So it's a big process of revising and reviewing the entire report. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you on the next chapter.